I had not planned on being stranded in a storm that night, and without an umbrella. I had only meant to take a short walk before heading back to my home. The rain had started as a light drizzle, nothing serious at first, but within minutes it turned steady and heavy, blurring the street lights and clearing the sidewalks. The change had happened quickly enough that I had not noticed how empty the street had become until I was already standing in it. My home was 20 minutes away on foot, and the rain showed no sign of slowing. There was a small cafe 3 blocks from where I stood that usually stayed open late. I had passed it many times on quiet evenings, but had never gone inside. With the storm building overhead and my jacket already damp at the shoulders, it felt like the most practical option available to me. The thunder started somewhere in the distance, low and steady, rolling across the sky as the rain thickened. I adjusted my collar against the wind and began moving in the direction of the cafe, keeping my head slightly down as water gathered along the edges of the sidewalk. By the time I reached the corner, every storefront along my street was closed, their lights dark behind rain-streaked glass. Only the cafe remained open. I crossed the street just as the rain shifted from steady to heavy, reaching the entrance moments before it began to pour in earnest. I pulled the door open and stepped inside, shutting out the wind and water behind me. The cafe was warm, and several customers were already seated at tables sipping coffee, talking quietly, reading books, or listening to music. It felt like the kind of place people naturally gathered when the weather turned. I saw a small table available next to the window. I took the coffee I had ordered and went to take my seat. From where I sat, I could see the street through the rain-streaked glass. The sidewalks were empty now. The woman behind the counter moved between the register and the espresso machine, and the low sound of conversation blended with the steady hum of the lights overhead. A few people near the back were talking about the boats, mentioning that the fisherman would be almost in now if there were any stragglers. The last storm warning had gone out early enough to get everyone back safely. Their conversation shifted easily from the weather to tomorrow's work schedules and who might need help if the docks were slick in the morning. The rain pressed steadily against the window. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small wrapped package, setting it carefully on the table beside my mug. It was the reason I had been caught in the rain in the first place. The shop had not finished preparing it until late afternoon, and I had left the house in a hurry to collect it before the storm rolled in. 30 years. The number still surprised me when I said it aloud. We had been married for 30 years now. I smiled at the thought and brushed a thumb along the edge of the box beneath the paper. It was small, simple, and exactly what I knew she would love. I set it down next to my mug and leaned back slightly in my chair. She will think this is exactly why she married me. I am always putting myself between a storm for her. I let out a quiet laugh at that and took a slow sip of my coffee. The rain against the window pulled me somewhere else. It reminded me of another night that sounded much like this one. I had been younger then, standing at the docks with a few friends, our fishing poles propped against the railing, more for habit than intention. The sky had shifted quickly that evening too, dark clouds gathering without much warning. Out beyond the harbor, a small boat had turned back toward shore, earlier than expected. The storm had moved in quickly that evening, sending several crews in ahead of schedule. As it approached the dock, we could see crates stacked along the deck and figures moving to secure the lines before the rain fully settled over the water. She was there, standing near the bow, steady despite the wind. I had not seen her before that night. Her hair was tied back loosely, and she moved with the kind of confidence that comes from growing up around boats and tide schedules. When the rain began to fall harder, one of the men on board called out to us from the dock, asking if we could help unload in exchange for a few fresh crabs. We secured the ropes and began hauling crates from the deck onto the dock, working quickly as the rain picked up. She moved alongside us, tying off lines and steadying the stacks as we passed them down. By the time the last crate was offloaded, we were all soaked through. Someone suggested getting out of the rain before the docks became slick. A few of us headed up the road toward this cafe, shaking water from our sleeves and laughing at how quickly the weather had turned. She walked beside me, carrying a small paper bundle wrapped in twine. We ended up at a small table near the window, just like the one I'm sitting at. She ordered tea. I ordered coffee. We talked into the night. I sat there smiling at the thought of our history together. It had been a storm just like this one that first brought our attention to each other, and we had been inseparable since. The small package rested beside my mug like something unspoken. It was more than a gift. It felt like a quiet continuation of a promise I had made 30 years ago, standing on a rain-soaked dock with no idea what the years ahead would hold. I took another sip of my coffee as a song drifted softly through the cafe. The rain was heavier now, tapping steadily against the glass. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small folded note I'd written to myself earlier in the day, reminding me to stop by the grocery store for a few things before heading home. I looked at it briefly and slipped it back into my pocket. That errand would have to wait. A foghorn sounded in the distance, long and low. Then another. The last boat had made it to shore. The sound carried through the storm and brought back another memory from years later, long after that first night at the docks. By then, I had become captain of my own boat. Summers felt longer in those days. The water ran warm and steady, and we spent as many evenings out on it as we could. One season in particular stood out. We lost count of how many fish we pulled in that year. The days began early and ended slow, often with the sun still resting low over the harbor. A storm had rolled in one afternoon, similar to the one pressing against the cafe windows now. We had been close enough to shore not to worry. I guided the boat back and secured it early, deciding there was no need to test the weather. She was there waiting for me at the dock, as she often was when she could make it down in time. Instead of heading straight home, she had brought a small basket with wine and a wedge of cheese wrapped in paper. She said the storm would pass quickly and that there was no reason to rush through it. We stayed on the boat after I tied off the lines. The rain settled steadily across the harbor, soft at first, and then heavier, tapping against the deck and roof in a rhythm that felt familiar. She handed me a glass, and we wrapped ourselves in thick blankets we kept stored beneath the bench. From where we sat, we could see other boats making their way in one by one, lights glowing faintly through the rain. Each time a ship reached the harbor, it sounded its horn, the low call carrying across the water before fading into the storm. We listened to them arrive. One, then another. We counted without speaking, sharing the quiet space between the sounds. The rain blurred the edges of everything beyond the dock, leaving only the shape of the harbor lights and the steady rhythm of the horns as ships announced their return. We stayed there until the rain slowed and the harbor grew still again. When the last boat had docked and the horns had fallen silent, we gathered the empty glasses, folded the blankets, and walked back home together along the damp boards of the pier. Another horn sounded in the distance, softer this time, pulling me fully back into the cafe. I lifted my mug and took another sip, letting the warmth settle slowly. The rain tapped steadily against the glass, not hurried, not violent, just persistent. Nights like this seemed to pause time. I had never followed any grand design, yet somehow life had filled itself in. What began with borrowed fishing poles and borrowed courage at the docks had grown into something steady and reliable. I built my own boat, not long after that first summer. What started as weekend trips became early mornings, long seasons, and eventually a livelihood I was proud to claim as my own. There were years when the water tested us, seasons when the catch ran thin, repairs that cost more than they should have, storms that arrived without warning. Through all of it, she remained exactly as she had been that first night, steady, practical, present. We raised 2 children in a house close enough to the harbor that the foghorns became part of their routine. They learned the difference between tides before they learned multiplication tables. Summer evenings meant grilled fish in the yard and neighbors stopping by unannounced. Winter brought quieter routines, card games at the kitchen table, and stories told more than once. It was not extravagant. It was not effortless, but it was ours. I set the mug down gently and watched a pair of headlights move slowly through the rain outside. Someone had decided the weather was manageable after all. The storm would pass eventually. They always did. I thought about the years between then and now, anniversaries marked with small dinners, arguments that lasted a few hours before dissolving into conversation, repairs made together, both in the house and in ourselves, the ordinary work of staying side by side. 30 years did not feel dramatic when lived one day at a time. It felt like mornings shared over coffee. It felt like standing at a sink together washing dishes. It felt like walking home through light rain after sitting on a boat longer than necessary. I glanced at the small package beside my mug. It was a simple gift. nothing elaborate. She would smile the way she always did, tilt her head slightly, and say I should not have gone to the trouble. Then she would wear it anyway. The rain softened slightly, shifting from heavy sheets back to a steady fall. The cafe door opened briefly as someone stepped out to test the weather. The air that followed in carried the cool scent of the harbor before the door closed again. I checked the time once more. Soon, I would finish my coffee, gather my jacket, and walk home. The rain had finally started to calm. It no longer struck the windows in heavy sheets, but fell in a steady rhythm that felt manageable. A few customers near the door began preparing to leave, testing the weather in small steps before committing to it. I finished the last of my coffee and set the mug down gently on the table. I reached for the small package and slid it carefully back into my jacket pocket, making sure it rested securely against the inside lining. I lifted my jacket from the back of the chair and slipped it on, the fabric still slightly cool from earlier, but no longer soaked through. After a brief glance toward the counter, I nodded to the woman behind it and made my way to the door. The bell chimed softly as I stepped outside. The air had shifted. The storm still lingered, but its urgency had passed. Rain fell in lighter drops now, tapping against the pavement instead of pounding it. The street glistened beneath the lamps, reflections stretching long across the wet surface. I pulled my collar slightly higher and began walking toward home. Water collected in shallow pools along the curb, but the sidewalks were clear enough to move comfortably. The harbor lay a few streets over, and the scent of salt carried faintly through the damp air. Somewhere in the distance, a final foghorn sounded once more, softer now, as if closing the evening rather than announcing it. Storms moved quickly along this coast. They arrived with force, unsettled everything for a while, and then moved on as though nothing had changed. I had seen enough of them over the years to recognize their rhythm. The sky darkened, the wind shifted, the rain pressed hard, and then gradually, almost without notice, it eased. I walked at an unhurried pace, letting the cooler air settle around me. The rain dampened the edges of my sleeves again, but it no longer felt like an inconvenience. It felt familiar. A few porch lights flickered on as I passed houses along the street. Curtains were drawn against the night. In one window, I could see a family gathered around a table, plates still set out as if dinner had just ended. The sight reminded me of how many evenings had unfolded similarly in our own kitchen over the years. I reached into my pocket briefly, touching the small package through the fabric of my jacket to reassure myself it was still there. It rested where it should be. The road curved gently toward the harbor before turning inland again toward my street. Puddles reflected the glow of the streetlights as I stepped around them. The rain continued to soften with each block. How quickly a storm could come and go. What felt urgent an hour ago now seemed distant. The cafe was already behind me. The harbor was settling. The town had resumed its quiet routine. Ahead, I could see the familiar outline of my house at the end of the street. The porch light was on. The rain had thinned to a light, steady fall by the time I reached the corner of my street. The storm that had arrived so suddenly now seemed almost gentle, settling over the houses in a quiet mist. Streetlights reflected in the damp pavement, and the air carried that clean, cooled scent that follows a heavy downpour. I walked at an easy pace, listening to the faint drip of water from gutters and eaves. Storms had a way of arriving with urgency and leaving without ceremony. An hour earlier, I had been caught beneath it, misjudging the sky. Now it felt like something that had simply passed through. As I approached the house, I could see the porch light casting a warm circle across the patio. The boards were darkened from the rain, glistening under the glow. Water still fell lightly from the roofline in thin streams. And then I saw her. She was standing on the patio, just beneath the overhang, arms loosely crossed, watching the street the way she always had when weather rolled in. A light sweater wrapped around her shoulders, hair slightly damp from stepping out into the mist. She had done this for years, meeting me at the edge of the storm rather than waiting inside. For 30 years now. She stepped a little farther out as I reached the gate. The sight of her there felt familiar, steady, almost expected. Storm or no storm, she preferred greeting me before I reached the door. I pushed the gate open and walked up the path, the small box pressing lightly against my side inside my jacket pocket. The rain tapped softly around us. She tilted her head slightly as I drew closer, looking me over the way she always did when I returned from the water or from town. Not checking for damage, just noticing. The rain clung to the edges of her sleeves and darkened the boards beneath her feet, but she did not seem to mind. She had stood there like this for years, greeting me at the edge of weather rather than waiting inside for it to pass. I stepped onto the patio and brushed a bit of water from my collar. She reached forward and did the same without thinking. A small, familiar motion that needed no explanation. The porch light cast a warm circle around us, soft against the damp night. The storm had come and gone, leaving the air cooler and the sky slowly clearing beyond the rooftops. I felt the small box resting inside my jacket and let my hand settle over it for a moment. 30 years of evenings had led to this one. I took the package out carefully and handed it to her.